Hello, my name is Yin Shao Loong. I'm the Executive Director of Institut Rakyat, a think tank. Colonialism has had quite a strong effect on the use and abuse of race in Malaysia. One of the principal effects, I would say, is the fact that when the British were colonizing Malaya, they tried to divide the society into racial groups. And these were racial groups based upon British classification of different types of Asians. So I think it's important to remember and to recognize that the concept of race, no matter where you look into it, throughout its history, is shifting all the time. While we may use race today to mean very specific or fixed things, or they may seem to us to be very fixed things, if you look back into the history of the idea, what happens is that it changes over time, and it's very malleable, very plastic. So the British themselves used to conduct a census. They conducted what I would say is probably the first population census in, say, British Malaya, the peninsula today. And they used to have, I think, maybe nearly under 100 categories. 100 different categories of people just from the archipelago, the Nusantara, right, Southeast Asia. Then you had people who were of mainland Chinese ancestry, and that was broken down into subgroups as well. You've got your Hakka, Hokchus, Teochews, etc. You've got people who are like Telugus, Tamils, Punjabis, Bengalis, so forth, etc., etc. Very diverse in terms of the initial approach to the census. But what happens over time, and this is the work documented by a US scholar called Charles Hirschman, whose papers actually are freely available online. He's been to Malaysia many times over the years. What Charles Hirschman documented was that the census categories shrank over time. What started out as an incredible diversity of, I guess you could call them ethnic categories, shrunk down to what we know today as, the sort of classic three, right? You've got your Malays, Indians, Chinese, there's a fourth, you've got a sort of others column, and then of course you have the Europeans as well, under colonialism. So what happened was that you could see the British starting to homogenize the diversity of social and cultural life in Malaysia in terms of these kinds of classifications. And the driving reason behind that, and the driving reason behind many changing definitions of race, was political power and the dynamics of political power. And the British wanted to structure Malayan society in this way because it made it easier to manage. When you manage society into distinct racial groups, you can separate them geographically, you can separate them by their economic function and their class. You can also separate them in terms of their administration, and you can also separate them in terms of what they perceive or what they're told their interests will be. Now, what do I mean by the last bit? In terms of the interests, the British set themselves up at the top of the tier of the colonial economy, or else why bother engaging in colonialism, right? You want to be top dog. But the way in which they set themselves up in that role was to offer themselves as the protector of each group. But the protector particularly for what they classified as the native Malay group. But overall, what you see is that the British begin to usurp power from the native sultans, and once they usurp power from the sultans, they justify their role by appearing as a protector to the Malays, who eventually over time become unable to defend themselves, particularly from other Asians. And these other Asians are basically the immigrant working groups that the British imported into Malaya to service the colonial economy. And these groups were primarily imported from three places, not two, but three. And those three places are China, India, or the British Raj, as it was called at the time, and the Dutch East Indies, or what we now today call Indonesia. People from the British Raj, from what we call India today, would primarily serve as plantation labor. There would be a small tier of the elite who were brought over as part of the colonial civil service and the policing force. The people from mainland China would come primarily as coolies, as manual laborers. People who work in the mines, people who work in the cities, in the docks and so forth. and a few more elite people coming as the merchant class, what would later be known as compradors. Comprador would be the middle layer between the buyers and the big bosses, the big companies. And that helped create the impression that, say, the ethnic Chinese were dominant in the local economy, because the typical merchant that people would go to on the street to buy their goods would be the Chinese retailer. But in terms of who controlled the economy, it was actually the European firms. And that insight wasn't really proven until 1950s, 1960s by a Malayan scholar called James Puthucheary. And James Puthucheary produced that study while he was incarcerated in Changi prison by the British. And it was the first study of Malay's political economy. And he basically went through all the records of the stock ownership, of the capital ownership, and he found and he looked at what ethnic group owned what. And really, that sort of layer and that screen, those forms of carefully selected ethnic specialization into economic areas are what allowed the British colonials to structure the economy and also play off different groups of Asians against each other, so that they would divert pressure away from the directing pressure against the British themselves in what would later become known as more conventional anti-colonial mobilization. To give a concrete economic example, while the British claimed to protect the Malays, they also tried to construct the Malay as a sort of yeoman farmer. And a yeoman farmer would be a sort of commoner back in Europe or feudal England, where this was a person who was bound to the soil, had to work the land for a living, and basically needed a feudal lord to protect them, right? Or effectively they financed the feudal lord by giving their labor and agricultural produce. The British also did that because they didn't want native Malays to get, or the Nusantarans from the East Indies, to get involved in trading commodity crops. They wanted them to stick to producing things like rice. The moment that Malay entrepreneurs at the agricultural level started to get into trying to produce rubber, which was very valuable commodity back then. It's a bit more like how palm oil is today. Rubber was the sort of king of the commodity circuit in the Malayan economy. When Malays tried to get into that, the British were actually actively police them out of that sector of the economy, and they were trying to reserve it, the plantations themselves, for the Europeans. And that's where Indian laborers would work. So there used to be a very dynamic Malay-speaking merchant class in this whole region. I mean, this is the reason why Malay emerges as a lingua franca, as a language of commerce. It's because people traveled around this region. They were either of Malay origin, or they were of other origins from neighboring islands, or perhaps even from Gujarat in India, but they learned to speak Malay, or Arab traders who learned to speak Malay, and they conducted their business in Malay because that was the language of trade, and therefore it points to the existence of a dynamic commercial Malay-speaking class. And this is something that scholars like Syed Hussein Alatas have brought up as well. But why was there no significant Malay trading class in colonialism? Why? Because the British engineered it out of existence through these kinds of policies of effectively economic divide and rule built on political divide and rule. And so on top of the system, every so-called racial group in colonial Malaya had a British protector. The protectors of the Malays had a different name. They were basically what you call the residents, right? These are the resident advisors who sat in the court of the Sultan, who basically took control of everything apart from Islam from the Sultan, and they administered the wealth of the state and the power of the state, and they just gave lip service, and they allowed the sultans to preside over things like adat, custom, as well as Islamic matters. Then for, say, the ethnic Chinese, there was literally a title called the British Protector of Chinese, right? There was a British fellow who there was also Protector of Indians, and they would so-called look after Chinese or Indian affairs. Now, once the anti-colonial movement began to heat up and then the British Empire began to collapse, what happened was that these functions of protecting each of these three racial groups in Peninsular Malaya, or British Malaya, was transferred over to three political parties that the British themselves set up. And these were the United Malays Organization, the Malayan Indian Congress, and the Malaysian Chinese Association. they were effectively based upon the original model established in British colonialism of protecting races. And protecting races from who? Not from the British, but from each other. Because there was an idea that somehow the native Malays, so to speak, couldn't adequately defend themselves from economic competition from immigrant groups, or what were considered at the time immigrant groups, such as ethnic Chinese or ethnic Indians. And likewise, each ethnic Chinese and each ethnic Indian group also needed its interests preserved vis-a-vis all the other groups. And so it's this whole check and balance system which diverted energy or political energy horizontally while diffusing the tension vertically up the political power ladder. British colonialism here, at least, was very much a commercial endeavor. Malaya was near the end of its days the single richest earner for the British Empire. The British Empire paid itself out of its World War II debt with a lot of the earnings from Malaya, of Malayan rubber being sold to the Korean War to build tires and so forth for the war effort over there by the US and other Western powers. And I think at times they made more money from Malaya, from the commodities sold from here, than they did from India. Now, they also did this without much manpower, right? So, and this is also true in the British Raj in India. It's a perennial question of Indian nationalists, Indian scholars over there, is that how could a few thousand English men and a few women control a country of hundreds of millions, right? And these are hundreds of millions of Indians who weren't necessarily unarmed, right? There have been uprisings before, but how could a few thousand people control a country of hundreds of millions? Through this, through ideas, through administration, by taking over key points of decision making, by displacing the native authority. And the model that they had in British India is what they imported over here because it's incredibly efficient in a sense. You could structure society that way. As to the geographical location, I think the British basically tried to experiment across the entire geography, but they favored the west coast of Peninsula Malaya because of the historic convenience of the shipping routes through the Straits of Malacca. The east coast of Peninsula Malaya, with the very rough waters of the South China Sea, the lack of a good natural harbor such as Penang or Singapore, or even Klang later on, made it less attractive as a site for development. And if you're going to have your ports on this area, you're going to want to have your plantations fairly close by. And Kuala Lumpur, capital city of Malaysia now, basically grew up as a business town. It grew up around business, right? It didn't really exist much prior to the British. The British are the ones who set it up, and it facilitated the logging industry. It facilitated plantation and shipments down through the Klang River into Klang Port. So it's pretty much built on colonial commerce. And because it was built in colonial commerce, when people were imported, labor was imported by the British, they effectively located them and sited them and placed them in the areas that they deemed necessary for the economy. So that's why today you find certain areas like brickfields, for example, have a strong, very ethnic Indian character. That's because they're old train yards. And the British tended to reserve labor on the trains for ethnic Indians, partly because they'd already built up a train network in India. I think there are more differences than that to account for the relative styles of the British versus the Dutch, and that's that's quite a complicated question. I think one of the best comparative studies of that was done by a British colonial civil servant, although he was a bit left-leaning, and he was based in Burma, and his name was John Furnival, or more commonly known as J.S. Furnival after his initials. And he wrote a comparative study of the Dutch East Indies and colonial Malaya. It's a classic work. Many early scholars of Malaysia have read that. And the differences go beyond punishment versus protection. They also get into the fact that the Dutch government was taking a more hands-off, laissez-faire approach. They were also scared of educating natives. They didn't want natives to learn Dutch ways. They tried to heavily discriminate against interaction, intermarriage. The British weren't too much in favor of that as well, but they were less harsh about it than the Dutch were. The Dutch were pretty much primarily commercial, not afraid to get into long, sticky wars, such as in Aceh. The British, at the same time, were no strangers to wars, but they decided not to engage in the heavy wars in Malaya because they found that they could get what they needed without resorting to arms. If you look at how the British conducted themselves in Kenya with the Mau Mau, the massacres there, it shows a very different face. If you look at how the British conducted themselves in South Africa in the Boer War, where they developed the first concentration camps well before the Nazis did, that shows a different face of British colonialism as well. I think the basic template has still been preserved from the colonial era. I would say there are some differences today, but there have been very few systematic studies of how ideas of race operated in the colonial period amongst different groups in society or different people in society versus how it operates today or closer to our times amongst different individuals in society. I mean, the best way you can capture that is by looking at documentation. Unfortunately, the British get a big say because they like to write lots of things down and they like to write their opinions of other people as well. Whereas on the other hand, it's a bit harder to find documentation coming from any of the Asian groups who were present in colonial Malaya. You could find a bit, for example, in the old Malay language newspapers if you could read Jawi, although I haven't tried to do that. You could find some, possibly in some of the Chinese newspapers, and if you can still get access to them, there were occasional Tamil language papers as well. But in terms of people's own personal writings, where you could get like an individual authoring an opinion, that, to my knowledge, is comparatively rare. So it makes it hard to track the full range of shifts. We can track it from a slightly later date. Once Malayans get a bit more articulate, they become more opinionated. So you can have people like, former Premier Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, who put his ideas down in the Malay Dilemma. That's a pretty comprehensive statement of thinking on race in relation to politics, the economy, society, even sexual reproduction, which really is the original preserve of race studies anyway. And he still stands by it today, because I think he recently republished a book, and in the foreword he says he wouldn't change a word. And then you've got people like Lee Kuan Yew as well, who's a relative contemporary of Mahathir at the time. His views on race and issues like eugenics are quite well documented. There's a few good papers that can be found online, scholarly papers that track his ideas over time. And you notice quite a lot of similarities in an acceptance of ideas like what you could call social Darwinism, where it boils down to the survival of the fittest. But just to be clear, Darwin never ever said that the fittest survive. It was actually his nephew who sort of misinterpreted his works and tried to popularize the eugenics movements, because Darwin's nephew actually was the founder of eugenics. But going back to colonial era, around the 1850s in England, in Europe, I would say, as far as to some extent the US as well, and most other places that were at that time colonized by most of the countries in those regions I just mentioned, there was a lot of debate about how to classify humans. And there are basically two big theories. The first theory owes a lot to biblical narratives, and this is what you could call the idea of monogenesis, in the sense that there's a single origin for all humanity, and according to the biblical narrative, that's Adam and Eve, right? So all the humans you see around the world, whatever color, shape, form they take, however they speak, they have two ultimate parents if you trace it back, and those are, one's called Adam and the other one's called Eve, right? But by the 1850s, belief in biblical narratives has started to weaken a bit. There had been a kind of growing doubt, crisis in Christianity, The debate going on in other faiths is not so well documented. The second idea competing against that is actually the diversity of humankind, the different colors of humankind, different shapes of humankind can be explained by the fact that we actually come from many different sources. So this is called polygenesis. And that humans, well, there's no such thing as humans collectively, right? There are people who are either black, white, red, yellow, and they pop up in different parts of the earth. There's no common biological basis to each other. Somehow they all have eyes, ears, heads, legs, whatever like that. They can speak, they're sentient, they're quite different from animals, but they don't come from the same source. And the differences, whether they're of looks, of speech, of culture, were deemed to be signs that there were radically different biological origins for these people. Now, it's also good to remember at this point as well that I think 60 to 70 years before the 1850s, people were positing, and one of the founders of modern biology, Carl Linnaeus, a Swedish scientist, was unsure whether orangutans were a type of human. He actually classified them as a type of human. And he's the guy from which we get the Latin classifications of things like Homo sapiens, or Canis lupus for the dog, for example. He's the inventor of that system. And so for Homo sapiens, he had different types. And one of the Homo sapiens was, I think, Homo monstrosus, the monstrous human, and that was the orangutan. So we fast forward to the 1850s. The debate is still going on about monogenesis, one origin, or polygenesis, many origins for humanity. And by this time, you had lots of theories put about. You tend to find that the more sort of liberal people tend to subscribe to ideas of monogenesis. I use liberal in the sense of them not being, not having such strong discriminatory ideas or attitudes towards people who have a different appearance to them. Right? On the other hand, you tend to find people who are hardcore racists, people who justify things like slavery, or people who look different, tend to favor the argument of polygenesis, that people come from different places. Because they're different species, it's okay to enslave them because they're either naturally inferior, naturally stupid, naturally brutish, naturally slavish. And these can be very powerful arguments. But it doesn't mean that someone who's a believer in monogenesis wouldn't support slavery, or that somebody who's a believer in polygenesis would necessarily not be against it. So you have these two hot debates, but then Darwin comes in with a third debate, and he tries to square the two, because both of those two debates have trouble explaining forms of scientific evidence like dinosaurs. So there were basically lots of white adventurers crossing the world with pith helmets, and they were digging up the earth, and they weren't only digging up Egyptian pyramids, they were also digging up things like dinosaur fossils. And the appearance of dinosaur fossils, of the giant lizards, threw into doubt some of the claims of monogenesis of the Bible, because up till then it was still current belief that the world had only been created 6,000 years beforehand, right? That the human race as such and all of creation was only 6,000 years old. Then people are finding fossils which look really, really old. How do you explain that? And then when they dig up more fossils, they see changes over time. Things that look fairly similar, like the same kind of creature, similar kind of creature, but changes over time. And things that we may take for granted today, that we now know today, for example, that birds are basically the ancestors of dinosaurs. Right? And that sharks maybe haven't changed very much since prehistoric era. And humans originate from apes, but this kind of stuff wasn't known back then. The science hadn't really been done. And the guy to really bring a lot of this together was Charles Darwin. And he tried to grapple with all these problems that the previous theories of race had. How do you explain the fact that the human race is all one, but there have been changes over time? And you can track some of those changes over time, that it's evolving. How can you have the same thing but it changes? Or how can you address the fact that despite people seemingly coming from different places in the world, that there's still some kind of common biology happening there, and that if you're actually of a different species, you shouldn't be able to interbreed and produce viable offspring, right? When a donkey and a horse breed, you get a mule, and a mule is infertile. Right? That's a classic case of different species not being fully fertile. They're slightly related, of course, if you trace them back, but by rights, if something is a race is basically the same thing as species. And if you're a different species, you should not be sexually compatible. Humans, as we found out through repeated experimentation, are sexually compatible. No matter what color you are or what color your partner is, if you reproduce, you can usually reproduce successfully unless you've got problems elsewhere. Right? You can produce a baby, you can produce children, and they will carry some of your characteristics. So Darwin tried to explain all this, and the way that he tried to explain very, very slow change over time was evolutionary theory. And evolutionary theory basically challenged both monogenesis and polygenesis. It challenged monogenesis by saying that actually the world could be a lot older than it is, and our ancestors actually may go back beyond Adam and Eve. It challenged polygenesis by saying there's serious doubt about whether you can actually argue that humans can be separate species because of the fact that they can interbreed. It's entirely possible, on the other hand, for a given species to be so geographically isolated for such a long time from the rest of its population that it changes because of the environment, and it changes in such a way that it can only interbreed with its own local unit and not with the rest of its originating pack. If that happened, then you could say that a new species had cropped up. And this is what you call branching. If you've seen the evolutionary trees in science, this kind of effect is what you call evolutionary branching, tree of life, so to speak. But humans are basically occupying one branch, right? Haven't split up. If we sent humans to Mars for several thousand years, or if there was a remote part of the world where humans could safely and quietly interbreed for thousands of years without interruption from the rest of the human population on the world, it's entirely conceivable that you could have a separate species split off. Entirely conceivable, especially if environmental conditions permit it. But that basically hasn't happened. And until that happens, you can safely say, based on Darwin's theory, that we are all one human race. There is no separate race. What people call races today is basically a holdover or leftover from one, polygenesis, two, parts of monogenesis as well, which tried to figure out, the different shades of people, and three, the idea that was put forward later by more sort of popular vulgarizers of Darwin's theory, that you could actually re-engineer or engineer races or new races in your own lifetime through breeding, through eugenics, and that these kinds of divisions could be made to stick. We now know it's been pretty well conclusively proven both in science as well as social science that there's no scientific or even logical basis to support the idea that there are different races of humans. There's only one human race. You can have what are technically called populations, which are basically clusters of usually geographically close people who may, as a result of being together over a long time, develop some fairly similar genetic characteristics like disease resistance or disease prone and so forth. That is a technical term called population. That's not enough to classify as a different species. A population is basically a subset of a species, a subspecies, but you're still part of the same race. Now, how do we cross the gap between that and, say, contemporary ideas of race? I would say the typical way in which we use race today, say in Malaysia and many other places, is to actually bundle together a few ideas. One is to take a stereotype about the way somebody looks, physical features, and then you bundle that together with certain stereotypes about their culture, about their behavior, and this of course includes language, and how you can expect them to act, right? How you can expect them to behave. And these things are bundled together. into a package of stereotypes. And that becomes race for us. And race, in effect, becomes a shorthand, a shortcut to know somebody without even actually bothering to actually get to know them, right? You can judge them purely on external, preconceived criteria. So I can look at any one of you and say, okay, you're kind of olive-skinned, you have dark hair, you talk in a certain way, maybe you're Greek, right? And Greeks, according to Germans, are lazy, they don't pay back their debts, right? And if I was just to judge you that way, then it would actually be quite unfair of me, because one, it could be entirely true that you may be a particular individual who does come from Greece, and you may have trouble getting up in the morning and getting to work, right? And getting your work done. And you may in fact be lazy. But it does not mean if I randomly go to the heart of Greece, to Athens, and pick out a person randomly from a crowd, that I will immediately pick a lazy person. And if I pick every single Greek out from the crowd, that every single one of them will be lazy. Because that stereotype doesn't hold. It breaks down when it's confronted with reality. Equally well, you can't say that you go to Klang and you meet someone who's of, ethnic Indian ancestry or origin, and that they're a necessary criminal by nature. But there are people who are, and there are politicians who are entirely prepared to say that. Equally well, you can't say that someone who's an ethnic Chinese is somehow more motivated to accumulate wealth and money over any other kind of person. And equally well, you can't say someone who's ethnically Malay is predisposed to be lazy or indolent, as the colonial British used to say, and many people still say today. That's based on a stereotype that is not based on fact, it may be based on narrow individual experience. But when you test it to logic, when you test it to logic in science, and you test it numerous times, you will find that it breaks down, and you'll find exceptions. Now, you can still find exceptions to this and still have a sort of racially prejudiced worldview. You can just say, you're just an atypical, Chinese, Indian, Malay, or whatever. You're an exception to the norm, right? But then, if you keep on testing it and testing and testing it, you may find that eventually you'll find more exceptions than the rule, right? I mean, to give another example, when you have those kind of conditions, playing about with a stereotype-based idea of race can be a very powerful way to mobilize people into feeling fear, anxiety, resentment, and hostility, perhaps, towards people of another group. And this is pretty much how it's played out. The ancestors of Asians who are now in Malaysia, were they racist before the British came along, right? Are the British the only ones responsible for these kinds of ideas? I would say no, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to call those other forms of difference, of marking otherness, of marking outsiders, necessarily to be racism or race thinking as such. You can say, take classical Chinese examples, right? The Chinese, mainland Chinese culture there drew a very strong distinction between people who are Chinese speaking and absorb Chinese culture and language, and everybody else being barbarians, or being devil spirits, or different kinds of spirits, or red-haired dogs, or red-haired spirits. There's a whole bunch of different epithets that are used in Chinese culture. And that's basically forms to mark strangers, people who look differently, who behave differently, who talk differently, as somehow either completely other, uncivilized, or even otherworldly, if you want to talk about the devil spirits and all that kind of stuff. So it's not necessarily a concept of race, but you could fit it within contemporary thinking about how people use race today. So you don't actually necessarily need to use the idea of race. But if you are going to use the idea of race today, and you're going to use the idea of race 170 years after Darwin, you're going to run into serious problems about being challenged on the scientific basis of your ideas. Because the work of Darwin and those who followed after him has basically completely debunked any scientific basis for race. Why? Because the moment you talk about race, you're invoking biology. And you're saying that you're effectively implying that the characteristics that you observe in someone, their behavior, their propensity to be lazy, to steal, to cheat, to lust after money, are all functions of breeding. Right? If you put two of those types of individuals together and they produce a child, that child will also have those same characteristics. This is a sort of the shorthand claim of race. And fundamentally, that can't be sustained by facts, logic, or scientific testing. It has given people the ammunition to address the scientific basis for race. If people are different color, that's not an issue of race. It's an issue of melanin. And the human race, all humans, have different types of have melanin in their bodies, and the melanin behaves in different ways, depending on historically how their ancestors lived and where they lived and how much time they spent there. But those kind of surface changes in terms of the melanin composition in their body, which basically affects your skin tone, has no fundamental impact on the ability of different humans to interbreed and to carry on the human race. Going by Darwin's definition, that doesn't constitute a race in itself. There's no scientific basis for that. The biology argument doesn't hold up because of that. So if you just want to make it about biology, profile for things like disease and so forth, that's fine, you're on safe ground. When you start to go down the sort of racist route or race thinking route of trying to link biological aspects to cultural aspects, that's where you get the popular idea of race. Right? And that's where you get into scientific trouble, because you can't really draw that, you can't draw that link and you can't establish that link. If you take, say contemporary African American, you take the current president of the United States, right? He's half Kenyan, right? He's more culturally American than he is culturally Kenyan. If you go by the biological determinist route, he would probably have a lot of Kenyan, or whatever you could consider to be Kenyan attributes. I don't know what those are. But he appears in all respects, apart from his name, to be thoroughly American in terms of his culture, his behavior, his beliefs, how he sees himself and how the rest of the world sees him. No one takes up the claim that he's somehow faking it or he's an aberration, and that he's an atypical Kenyan. He's, to all respects, considered an American. Right? So the people who try and claim that, I would say, need more exposure to science as well as social science. There's been very heated debates within the anthropological fraternity, particularly about the issue of race, because anthropology as a discipline has a lot of guilt and baggage from the colonial era, where anthropology really came about and really boomed and bloomed as a discipline because it was used to gather research on what the colonial powers saw as different races of humanity. And there's a certain branch of anthropology called physical anthropology, which actually measures the size of skulls and tries to correlate issues of biological as well as intellectual difference based on the size of someone's skull. That goes back into a guy called Blumenbach, who was actually a monogenicist and wasn't a racist at all, actually. But he, for some reason, liked to classify humanity according to the shapes of skull that they had, and he classified them on a scale of beauty. He had European skulls, which he considered to be the most beautiful. In fact, they weren't called European, they were actually called Caucasian, and that's where the term Caucasian comes from. It comes from Blumenbach, who put humanity on a scale of most beautiful to the least beautiful. In terms of the Caucasians, then either the Mongoloids got it next, then the Africans came third, the Polynesians and Malays came fourth, and then maybe the Native Americans came fifth or something like that. He also used the term Malay as well, but in a very different idea, because it was referring to Polynesia. But that form of approach to anthropology, although there are still a few places in the world that practice it today, there's still very, 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 very few of them. Basically died out by the middle of the 20th century. People used to do it here. I've seen photos of people basically taking shots of people's heads, the side profile and the front profile, very much clearly within that tradition. And that was done here with Orang Asli groups. Some people are obsessed about race, and I think overall it's unhealthy to be obsessed about it, and I think it's also actually fundamentally unhealthy to keep on using the concept, although it's hard to get away from because it's so deeply ingrained as part of our mental furniture. And it's a very big and bulky piece of furniture to move around or even to throw out or to replace. The reason why I'm against it is basically because it's based on a bunch of stereotypes, and those stereotypes don't hold up to the facts. And because they're inaccurate, they actually prevent us from getting to the truth. And whether that's big T truth, or in terms of science and knowledge and so forth, or even little t truth in terms of getting to know somebody, it forms a type of social barrier. And that is how it's designed. It's designed to form a social barrier, to divide people, to make them easier to manage for their political superiors. And if we continue to use the idea of race, continue to be obsessed about race, what does that really imply? The ideas of race in Malaysia are usually tied to ideas of being threatened by another race, being anxious for the fate of your own race, to see that your group, as defined by your race, has common interests. And those common interests are defined versus and against other races. What does this mean for society? What does this mean for individuals? It means fundamentally that you are alienated from other people. You are alienated from your fellow citizens, from your fellow humans. And while you may find other ways to bridge that, say through your career, your work, common practice, common interests, common hobbies, as long as you carry this idea of race, you will have a ready-made, although false, division that's going to come between you and the rest of those around you. And that division always has the potential, because it's been proven before by human history, always has the potential to be activated, to be mobilized, and to be militarized. It can become violent. Which in a way ironically refers back to one of the original arguments made by people who practice race politics, is that we have to protect ourselves from violence, and therefore we need to practice preemptive violence in order to save ourselves from another group racially practicing some form of racial violence towards us. That is a vicious cycle. It's a cycle of hatred, of antagonism, of resentment, of suspicion that actually needs to be broken down, I think, for us to better build a common collective existence, because Malaysia is very much a nation in the process of formation. It's a project, a political project of sorts that we all take part of, and we need to find ways to have something in common. Now, that's not to say that unity is the most important thing, because unity is often overplayed, and unity is often used within racial boundaries as well, to mobilize people against other unities that may threaten them. At the same time, I think it's important not to erect false walls. We've got too many walls around us already, and erecting false walls is only going to make it harder for us to figure out the rest of the problems that we still have to address, like economic inequality, improving the functioning of democracy in the country, in terms of finding, because you have social expectations around you, that you have to like or love or hang out with people who look like you. And that's a burden a lot of Malaysians live under, and it's a form of oppression actually. And it doesn't have to be that way. You can just hop across the water to other countries and see that it can be different. These kinds of restrictions, these kinds of social divisions and personal divisions based around this idea of race are very much particular to here as well, to the Malaysian context. And my stance is that we use, or would like to use, or would rush to use the term like race, and to think twice before we use it. What do we actually mean when we say, oh yes, all the races are here? All the Malaysians are here. What's the difference between the two? What are you trying to say when you use the word race? What are you trying to say that couldn't be explained by another term, like say ethnicity, or by grouping, or by some other form of understanding collective groups of humans. I think these kinds of thought patterns and habits of thought require us to be vigilant. They require us to ask questions. They require us to understand history as well. And they require us to understand our own motivations in why we use them and what effects they have when we do use them on other people.